Well, thank you, Rosalind and Nat, and I want to thank Fuzz for inviting me to be here. And I have actually a little bit of a long relationship with RTB, at least from my perspective. I used to go to the Sierra Madre office way back, was that over 25 years ago or so? I used to visit, and they had cubby holes with Dr. Ross's articles in there and other articles, and I used to go, and they used to take those and mail them out to people, but I used to drive by, go back there, pull out the articles, put them in a notebook, and get equipped and read them, and so I did that for a long time until they moved. And when I was at New Song as a pastor, we had a good relationship with Reasons to Believe, their speakers coming, partnering now with the AMP conference and stuff like that. So I'm very, very pleased and honored to be a part. I've been a big fan and glad to partner with Reasons. So today, my contention is that Jesus, whatever he was and is, should actually be considered a philosopher. And why in the world would that matter? And I think that understanding that Jesus is a philosopher has a number of implications, actually, for both the Christian and the non-Christian, for our discipleship unto Christ. Actually, I think it can impact our communal practices and impact our evangelism as well. And I'll mention some of those more deeply at the end, just to name a few. But I think that investigating and understanding anything about Jesus, whatever he was, whatever he is, will actually bear fruit in our life. So whatever title, whatever position he held, I think is worthy for us to investigate, and I think will ultimately bear fruit in our lives. I started thinking about this a number of years ago, back when I was a student at Talbot Theological Seminary. We had the great privilege of having USC professor and the late Dr. Dallas Willard to come, and he would come and he would make this proclamation fairly regularly, and he would say, Jesus is the smartest man who ever lived, right? Many of you probably heard that from him. And that phrase would ring in my ear quite a bit. I was a newer Christian, not brand new, but a newer Christian, and I was used to thinking about Jesus as Lord and Savior, but to hear him be talked about as the smartest man who ever lived really intrigued me. And so when I began teaching philosophy a few years later at a local Christian university, we were required to be evaluated on how we took our discipline and how we integrated faith with that particular discipline. Now, with philosophy, I find that that's not too hard to do. But I tried to find ways to go deeper with that integration, if you will. And what I noticed was we would take the pre-Socratic philosophers, the Italians, the pluralists, the Ionians, and then we would jump into Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle, and then the textbook would move us about 1,700 years forward to René Descartes. And so it was this interesting leap. Now, it's partially my fault for picking the textbook. It was a good textbook, but it would leap, and a number of textbooks actually do this. Now, what I began to see was that from Aristotle all the way to Descartes, most of the philosophers, arguably, are influenced in some way, shape, or form by Jesus himself. And I wondered, could it be that these people are not just influenced from Jesus the theologian, but are they influenced also from Jesus the philosopher? What I noticed is that there were very few resources, at least that I was aware of, that would point me in this direction to thinking about Jesus as a philosopher. And many people seem open to identifying Jesus with various different titles, but were reluctant, very reluctant, to identify him as a philosopher. So for instance, if you just go onto your computer and you type in, was Jesus a, what starts to come up are things like this: a Buddhist monk, a Jew, a real person, a sun god. But you'll notice what's not there. A philosopher doesn't necessarily come up. Now, some of that can depend on your searches and things like that, but generally I've done this on different computers and that, and what you'll notice is that philosopher doesn't come up. Now, we could ask other questions, like, was Jesus a builder, or what more commonly known, was Jesus a carpenter? And we're fairly comfortable in saying yes to that, are we not? He spends probably, 12 years as a child, give or take, 3.5 years in the nonprofit sector, teaching, preaching, and that. But when you think about it, he spends 18 years in the for-profit sector building. Now, there probably wasn't a lot of trees and things in that around where he lived, but a lot of stone and things of that. So he was a builder making things, and we seem to be fairly comfortable with that. Now, we could also ask this: does it matter? Does it matter whether we think of Jesus as a carpenter? Well, many people do think it matters. Take Tim Keller, contemporary author, pastor. He wrote a book called Every Good Endeavor. In that book, he says that Jesus being a builder really helps influence our views on vocation and work. In fact, Jesus' gospel should change our perspective on work, give us a new spirit, technically the Holy Spirit, to work in partnership with our work. So we have a new power for our work. So not only is Jesus as Lord in Keller's mind, but through his vocation, Jesus as a builder has a tremendous impact, he thinks, for our lives. Now, we can continue this, and we could ask other questions. Like, for instance, you may have seen an ad campaign a number of years ago. If I can get it up there. There we go. Was Jesus a vegetarian? Now, I don't know if you recognize the ad, but this comes from PETA. Now, probably a Jew who ate the Passover was not likely a vegetarian. But our good friends at PETA would like us to certainly think that Jesus was a vegetarian. Again, let me ask, does it matter? Well, according to Bruce Friedrich, PETA's vegetarian campaign coordinator, he said, quote, "This campaign, Jesus was a vegetarian, has been perhaps our most successful campaign ever." So this matters to people and how we identify Jesus. Just an interesting side note, PETA's had to drop this ad campaign because a certain order of priests, the priests of the Sacred Heart, claim ownership of this particular picture or a version of it. So they've asked them to drop using the picture. So PETA's in the market for a new picture of Jesus. So be on the lookout for a new campaign with a new picture of Jesus. Now, what about Jesus as teacher, prophet, theologian, healer? Those are all titles that we tend to be comfortable with. But if we move on to saying, was Jesus a student, perhaps? Here's something that I find interesting. I find that my philosophy students, particularly the Christian philosophy students, not all of my students are Christian, but my Christian philosophy students start to get uneasy when we talk about Jesus being a student. Why? In part, they think, and I've had them write this out, they think it detracts from his divinity. Yet, of course, if we look at the end of Luke 2:52, we find that it says Jesus grew in stature, in age, right? His body grew. He grew in favor with God, favor with man. But he also grew in what? You remember? With wisdom, which has to include knowledge. So Jesus was a student. He probably learned from Joseph for that, how to be a builder. So he was a student. And as we learn in the creeds, why does this matter? Well, our understanding of Jesus as being truly human impacts our whole understanding also not only of how Jesus functioned, but our understanding of salvation and redemption history as well. Now, when I ask the question, what was Jesus a philosopher? Now, people seem to get more uneasy, and here the literature bears this out. The question, in some ways, turns out to be easily dismissed by some writers, some historians, some other philosophers, and actually currently is still very hotly debated. Now, some people like historian Humphrey Carpenter find it just quite painless to just dismiss Jesus as a philosopher because he says that he was a Jew and not a Greek. And that is his reasoning. He says, quote, "Jesus himself was no philosopher. His mind was characteristically Jewish." But your mind probably quickly went to the fact, well, but by that criteria, we'd have to get rid of Lao Tzu, the Chinese thinker. We'd have to get rid of Nietzsche, who was German, and most philosophers aren't willing to do that. Carpenter argues also that Jesus was very unsystematic in his views, and so therefore that would disqualify him as a philosopher. But once again, if you were to look at Socrates, if you were to look at Nietzsche or someone like Wittgenstein, their views were a little bit unsystematic as well, and people aren't willing to get rid of those philosophers. If we looked at a well-respected encyclopedia of philosophy, like the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you'll notice that it has no entry for the person of Jesus as philosopher, but it does have an entry for Buddha in this particular case. After about a year of teaching philosophy, I was enthralled as I stumbled upon a published book entitled On Jesus. And that book is part of the Wadsworth Philosopher series. In that particular book, Denver Seminary professor, philosophy professor Douglas Groothuis argues, yes, indeed, Jesus is or should be considered a philosopher. One quick note, my apologies to Professor Groothuis if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I'm very familiar with names being mispronounced. Having a name like Haraksin, people say Harkinson, Haraskin. I even got harassment as my last name. So my apologies to Professor Groothuis if I'm not saying it right. Really, like people like me, we should change our last names to fit our philosophy sort of vocation. There are philosophers, one guy's named John Wisdom. Another great philosopher, J.J.C. Smart. So if you're going to be a philosopher, you might as well have a last name like Wisdom or Smart, or I guess here, Samples will do just fine. Now, in this particular book, Groothuis recalls a particular situation that won't be unlike our modern day situation here. In a presidential debate back in 1999, the moderator of that debate asked this question. They asked, who is your favorite, to the candidates, who is your favorite political philosopher? And then the answer kind of surprised the moderator, the other candidate, and even the audience that was present at the time. And the then candidate, George W. Bush, turned and responded to the question, who is your favorite political philosopher? And he said, quote, Jesus Christ, because he changed my life. Now, heaven only knows how the current candidates would answer that question. I'll leave you to debate that post-office hours. So the then candidate, Bush, his answer, you might look at it and say, well, Jesus is my favorite because he changed my life. Now, is that just a purely a devotional type of response, a reaction of personal piety in that? Well, I'm sure it was to a degree, but that shouldn't disqualify or derail us in thinking about Jesus as being a philosopher. I'm pretty sure if you would have interviewed Plato for a position and asked him, who's your favorite political philosopher, he would have said, hey, that dude Socrates, he's the one. I can say that because I worked in San Dimas, the home of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. No doubt Socrates changed Plato's life. And Plato was devoted to him as a student, as a disciple. So that shouldn't disqualify someone as being a philosopher as well. Well, Groothuis, in the book on Jesus, he says this. He says, was Jesus, whatever else he may have been, a bona fide philosopher? And if the answer is yes, several other engaging sorts of questions then emerge. For instance, what kind of philosopher was he? What did he believe and why? How does his philosophy relate to the other philosophers of that period, of that time? Does his philosophizing have anything to contribute to contemporary philosophical debates? And just what is, Groothuis asks, what is a philosopher anyway? And does Jesus fit that particular description? Now, H.L. Mencken once quipped that the best definition of a philosopher may be one who contradicts another philosopher, and that might be good enough to get us going. But as Grotius says, philosophers philosophize. But of course, not everyone who philosophizes is a philosopher. Just like not everyone who picks up a pair of drumsticks and pounds on the drums is a drummer. Believe me, I know this. I'm also a professional drummer, and I just don't play one on TV, if you know what I mean. So Grotius observes that we usually think of philosophers as very intelligent persons. At least some do. But not all intelligent persons are philosophers. I mean, some are scientists. Do I get an amen here? Right? So when we think about it, we don't want to limit those who are candidates for being philosophers to maybe those who just are intelligent and things like that. But should we say that to be a philosopher, you have to hold a professorship or be a part of an academic institution? But that would wipe out a number of other people that we think are philosophers, like David Hume and Spinoza and Pascal. They weren't affiliated with prestigious or institutions as such. So we have to ask, what might be the sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for being a philosopher? Philosophers like to use terms or distinctions like necessary and sufficient conditions. And all we mean by that is coming up with criteria. Does Jesus fit a good criteria of what it means to be a philosopher? And so Grotius asked this. He says, the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a philosopher, whether good or bad, major or minor, employed or unemployed, he says, are a strong and lived out inclination to pursue truth about philosophical matters through the rigorous use of human reasoning, and to do so with some intellectual facility. And so the question is, does Jesus fit that description? Now, we don't have time to go through all the different scriptures that would support this, but to sort of cut to the chase, when we look at Jesus in the Gospels, what does Jesus affirm? I would say he affirms the life of the mind. He affirms rationality and the use of logic in argumentation. He affirms philosophical curiosity and rational inquiry. He also affirms that truth is knowable and is testable, that he even points to certain evidence to justify his claims. He also uses questions in order to lead people to truth. He, as well, answers questions that arise from the major fields or branches of philosophy. So he actually delves into the different areas, the different branches of philosophy. Now, if you're not familiar with those different branches, when you look at philosophy, we have at least 4 different branches. Metaphysics, which is a study of reality, what is real, what is absolute or fixed as opposed to in flux. Epistemology is what our theory of knowledge is. How do we justify truth claims? Value theory, where do we get or understand our worth and importance of things and of human beings? The subfields of ethics and aesthetics are included in that. And also the field or the branch of logic, right reasoning. And so Jesus actually has something to say with respect to most all these philosophical matters. And actually, when one investigates it, you find that he is quite adept at using these categories. So I think, based on the information that I have seen, that I think Jesus fits the conditions that are sufficient for being a philosopher. And we might want to ask, well, what kind of philosopher was he? What kind of philosopher, what kind of area of philosophy, or what kind of philosophy does Jesus really fit in? And what did he believe along the way? Well, Jesus really, I would say, is not a discussion-oriented philosopher, but rather an obedience-oriented philosopher. Let me say that one more time. Jesus is not a discussion-oriented philosopher, but an obedience-oriented philosopher. One illustration of this is the parody when we sometimes think of philosophers, I don't know what you think of, but you kind of think of someone, take their glasses off and they're thinking and, It said of Epicurus that he was trying to be so tranquil that he had to have friends around him to catch him so he wouldn't fall off cliffs and be run over by chariots and things like that, because he was so much in thought. And I remembered the Monty Python parody of Philosophers. If you haven't seen it, it's called Philosopher's Soccer. And two teams come down, and it's the Greek philosopher team, and it's the German philosopher team, and they rush down to play soccer, and they get onto the field, and the referees, Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, and Confucius, are all there, and they put down the soccer ball. And after they put down the soccer ball, Confucius blows the whistle, and then the philosophers go at it, and they turn, and they think, and they ponder. Why is grass green? What is the form, the circle of the ball? Is it abstract? Is it within the matter? And you see the ball just sitting there on the field, and the philosophers walking back and forth, talking and thinking, and nothing is happening. It's discussion-oriented. There's a famous saying that philosophy bakes no bread, right? And that's how we tend to think of philosophy. At one point, one of the Greek soccer players says, "Eureka!" He runs over to the soccer ball, kicks it, runs it down the field, scores the goal. The Greeks go crazy, and then, of course, the Germans dispute it with their best philosophy. Hegel at the front, of course. In a paper by philosopher Paul Moser, please listen to what he says. He says this. He says, Jesus' love or agape commands have very important implications for how philosophy is to be done, specifically for what questions need to be pursued. And Moser distinguishes between two human modes, discussion mode and an obedience mode. And he says, quote, philosophy done under the authority of Jesus, or the way Jesus did it, this type of philosophy, under his authority, under his love commands, must transcend the discussion mode to realize an obedience mode of human conduct. Under the authority of Jesus, philosophy becomes agape-oriented and obedience-oriented. And in this respect, Moser says, Jesus is Lord of philosophy. So in other words, there is a challenge here. Philosophy isn't to remain in a discussion mode, but there is an obedience mode that is naturally a part of it. And I think this is what starts to make philosophers and others very, very uncomfortable along the way. Now, what did Jesus believe? We don't have time to go into this, but what did he state? Let's just get a taste of what he stated as being a philosopher. Jesus had a view and an affirmation of rationality, and he used logic. He didn't disparage using rationality, and Jesus engaged in logical arguments that are worthy of being a philosopher. Now, you will remember, as Josh McDowell rightly said many years ago, Jesus was more than a carpenter, and we can say that Jesus is more than a logician. But the Gospels that describe these supernatural acts of Jesus also record a number of very robust, rational encounters that reveal a strong concern for logic and various uses of argument forms. For instance, Jesus knows how to get off of the horns of a dilemma. He knows a false dichotomy when he sees it. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. He employs argument forms like a reductio ad absurdum and modus ponens and a fortiori. And here's one particular example. Take the example from Luke chapter 13. You may remember in this particular chapter, there's a crippled woman. And this crippled woman is healed by Jesus on the Sabbath. And the synagogue ruler gets upset over this. In fact, the text says that he becomes indignant. And then he looks at the crowd and he says to the crowd, there are 6 days for work. So come be healed on those days and not the Sabbath. And then Luke reports this response from Jesus. The Lord answered and said, you hypocrites, do not Do not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it away to water it? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, think of it, he says, for 18 years be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath. The argument form that Jesus uses here is an a fortiori argument form. We don't need to go through the details of the exact logical form here. But when we look at it, the argument is like this. The Jews, premise one, lawfully release animals from their confinement on the Sabbath out of concern for the animal's well-being. Well, irrelevantly, a similar situation, a woman's well-being, that is being freed from a terrible illness, is far more important than watering an animal. So therefore, if watering an animal on the Sabbath is not a Sabbath violation, then Jesus' healing the woman on the Sabbath is not a violation of the Sabbath. Luke then records the response of the people present. And he says, verse 17, and when he said these things, that is Jesus, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. And make note, the glorious things, one of them, yes, was the healing. It was that this woman was healed. But also one of the glorious things was Jesus' use of logic and the dignifying of the human mind. And notice that his critics were silenced and the people were amazed at how he could interact with them. Dallas Willard says, Jesus' aim in utilizing logic is not to win battles. This is important. But to achieve understanding or insight in his hearers. He presents matters in such a way that those who wish to know, they can find their way to, can come to the appropriate conclusion as something they have discovered, whether or not it is something they particularly care for. That, I think, is a very powerful statement. Now, we could go on and multiply examples here of Jesus' use of logic. But just this one example, I think, is enough for today to point us in the direction that knowing that Jesus actually knew how to use logic and used it quite well. Jesus also has something to say about metaphysics. Let me just state this quickly. Metaphysics deals with what exists, what kinds of things exist, what is real, what is not real, what constitutes the human person. Are we composed of merely body and brain, or are we composed merely of mind, immaterial, or are we composed of two things, body and soul? A good argument can be made that Jesus' view from the Gospels is that Jesus argued that we have both a body and a soul, two substances, a soul and a body that interacted in a very deep and unified way. What this means is that Jesus seems to implicitly reject some type of physicalism where we are just body and brain, and also reject some type of idealism where we're just purely spirit, purely mind. And he says that there are two things, body and soul, that we are composed of. Now, it's kind of fashionable today to say, well, look, that's just a leftover of Greek philosophy that has influenced the church. But you can make a very strong case that Jesus' view differs from Plato's Greek view and other views, other modern views, such as René Descartes' substance dualist view. Jesus' view is very different than both of those, actually. We see a couple of scriptures where Jesus seems to point to this. He says, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. He also says, that went fast, watch and pray, this is when they're in the garden, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And I do realize that flesh sometimes in the New Testament can refer to soulish, sinful dispositions. But in this particular context, where they're sleeping in the garden, it's very likely that flesh here is referring specifically to the body. So Jesus has a number of statements that distinguish this, that the soul and body, though deeply united, when the body dies, the soul can go into an intermediate state that is sustained by God for a period of time, but yet it awaits a time of resurrection when the body and soul is reunited, and that is what's called glorification, of course. This, as I'll mention in just a moment, has a number of powerful, I think, applications and communal applications. Two final things. Jesus' epistemology. We can't take as much time on these. But Jesus' theory of knowledge, he had seemed to have a very specific understanding of what he counted as evidence, that he was willing to point to empirical evidence to justify some of his claims and some of his identity. But perhaps a distinguishing mark of Jesus' epistemology, how you come to know things and what justifies that knowledge, is that Jesus seems to show that who we are affects what we know. Who we are, both intellectually and morally, affects what we can know. Also, who we cling to also affects who we become. Many of you know that you can travel right over here to the Claremont colleges or other universities, and many will have this reference from John. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. But many of us probably know the little phrase right before that. Does anyone remember what it is? The way? Right, and right before he says, you are my disciples, he says, if you remain in my teaching, then I know that you are my disciples. If you hold to my teaching, he says, you are really my students, my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It's actually loyalty to Jesus that leads to the knowledge that liberates someone. And so Jesus has what philosophers call an emphasis on intellectual virtues as well as moral character virtues. One must be willing to be patient, to be morally serious, to pursue truth with honesty and a sense of openness and with humility in order to achieve it. For us, today who've grown up in the West, particularly been affected by the physical sciences with a naturalistic bent, we have sort of, the way I would say it, I don't think we've thought ourselves into this, but we have been massaged into a view that objects and things in the universe, we can explore and know them despite our moral character or our moral disposition or our intellectual virtues. But it seems that, according to Jesus, there are at least some areas of knowledge where that simply will not do. This may be particularly true when it comes to knowing persons. Now, we all know this when it comes to relationships and things like that. You can know the person exists right before you, but I have been in an argument before with my wife. She usually wins. I get more emotional, she gets more logical. So that's why I went into philosophy, to get trained so I wouldn't have to be so emotional. You can be present, but someone will say, you're a million miles away from me. One has to be morally serious and open and humble in order to know the person who may be sitting right next to you. This may transfer well when we're dealing with the problem of evil or what's called the hiddenness of God. One cannot be just passively open to searching after God. One must be morally serious about seeking God. That one has to be open to one's obeying and being obedient to God. This would transfer well if we had time to talk about Jesus' ethical understanding, how he focuses on character, inner virtues, but also integrates commands, duties that we have to do, but also takes into consideration, the consequences of a particular situation. I don't have time to talk about it now, but what I have found is that many preachers and pastors, as I listen to them talk about ethics, tend to put Jesus just in what's called the deontological system of ethics. That God just gives us commands, and we are to obey those commands. But Jesus seems to be more of what's called a virtue ethicist. Yes, he cares about God's commands, but he also cares about the developing inner virtues that connect to those commands so that ultimately we can act fully virtuously without knowing what the right hand and the left hand is doing, according to what Jesus says. The only way, and I know this as a drummer, the only way for me to forget about my right hand and left hand is to actually be playing in such a way and to have training and skill and habituation so that I forget about them and it just flows through me. This is in part of how we're to develop in partnership with the Holy Spirit when it comes to ethics. And Jesus has a distinctive ethical posture that I think is worthy our investigation, especially pastors and those who are preaching specifically. So, was Jesus a philosopher? Of course, my answer here today is yes. Does it matter? I think it matters a great deal. Just like it matters if Jesus was human, if he was a teacher, prophet, priest, king. I think it matters if he was a philosopher. Why? Let me just mention a couple of things. I think it enlightens and gives us a deeper understanding of who Jesus is. And of course, we can all benefit from that, but just not Christians. I think non-Christians too. When we engage Jesus as being a philosopher, it shows us a new dimension of Jesus, and it actually gives us a set of categories, metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, ethics, logic, for us to think from and to think through when we're examining him and his life and his teachings. But it can also show non-Christians that there is a new dimension out there maybe that they haven't explored, a new philosophy. They can be introduced to this new philosopher. I would love it to see Jesus included more in these lists of philosophers because, as Willard said, he's the smartest man that has ever lived. Finally, secondly, I think knowing Jesus as a philosopher also can transform a number of our common and our communal practices. One thing that I learned from studying Jesus and then following him, Paul, especially as I ventured upon my philosophy career, was there's a big difference between arguments and quarrels. I try to get my classes to say, arguments are good, quarrels are bad, right? If I walk up to them at the beginning of the semester and I say, I want to get into an argument with you, they automatically will feel what? Defensive. Because they equate arguments with quarrels. And the big thing we learn, I think, in Jesus' teaching, and as Jesus as a philosopher, is that arguments are not the same thing as a quarrel. In fact, Jesus is embedded in a tradition that goes, of course, all the way back to Genesis, but with Proverbs and the wisdom of Proverbs about how we aren't to engage in quarrelsome behavior, how we need to not engage certain people who are going to stir up strife and anger, but we don't want to neglect having good arguments and rational discussion with people. I was reminded of Proverbs 15 that says, those who are hot-tempered stir up strife, but those who are slow to anger calm contention. Also, I think it's Proverbs 17. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, so stop before the quarrel breaks out. You see this being applied in Jesus' life. Sometimes his brothers will say to him, you'll see this in John, Jesus, why don't you just get out there and reveal yourself? And he says, no, it's not the time, and he hides. Others will try to engage him in a discussion, and he sees the tension building up, and he chooses to leave that setting. This takes wisdom, it takes practice, it takes skill, but Jesus honors this. But yet at other times, he engages fully with rational dialogue using various kinds of argument forms. You may not know this, I used to work for Disneyland Hotel as a restaurant manager. And as I was studying some of these things, I would be studying my philosophy and head right over to my job as a manager of a fine dining seafood and steak restaurant over at the Disneyland Hotel. And when I would go there, I had on my staff a real diversity of people. And when we would be doing side work or doing other work, sometimes we'd be sitting around the oyster bar together, and they knew what I was and what I was studying for, and they would start to, sort of pepper me with questions. And one time I had sitting with me a Mormon woman, these are all servers, a Mormon woman, another gentleman who was Buddhist, an Armenian nominal Christian, an atheist, a person who identified as a gay man but was agnostic. We had a Jehovah's Witness and a couple of other more, I might say, very fundamentalist type Christians, as they would identify themselves. And they would throw out topics, and one day, Steve was his name, he was the gay agnostic. He says, George, he's looking at the paper and he says, are you like one of these guys that protests gay people's weddings? And I go, Steve, are you one of those guys who ask obnoxious questions to Christians like me? And he laughed. And I said, so what do you think about that? And using Jesus' technique, as RTB does so well, drawing him into discussion, I really wanted to know what he thought. And he was drawn in, and all of a sudden, I had the Mormon view on this, and I had the Buddhist view on it, and I had the agnostic view, and everyone was just jumping in this wonderful dialogue. And I was very, very satisfied. I'm just wondering, this would be a conversation Jesus would have. But there were other nights, like New Year's Eve, busiest night of the year, 2 to 4 hour waits to get into the restaurant. 11 p.m. staying up late, people coming in. I would dialogue with guests. I always had a good time doing that. I had two couples come in, sat down at the table. The waitress comes past me. She walks by. She says, that's it. She's in tears. I'm done. She says, you handle it. Her husband was standing behind me, who was also a server. He was about 6'4", ex-football player. I turned to him. His name was Neil. I said, Neil, why don't you go handle the table for your wife? He goes, I'm not the manager. You handle it. And so I said, I guess you're right. So I walked over to the table, and I said, is there a problem? Can I help you? Immediately, one of the men, who obviously had been drinking downstairs before, jumps up. He's probably 2 to 4 inches taller than me, looks at me, and says, this is the worst meal, the worst service, the worst everything I've ever had. I said, sir, if you would just calm down. He says, don't you tell me to bleep and calm down. I said, okay, sir, why don't you just have a seat? He says, don't you tell me to bleep and sit down. I said, sir, okay, why don't we step outside? He goes, you're bleeping right, we're gonna step outside. I said, let's just stay right here. Because I got witnesses. See, I got witnesses here. And he said, sir, if you would just allow me, he says, look, you, and I'm thinking of these Proverbs, actually. And I look at him, and I'm going to go, I'm trying to argue with this guy, and he hasn't argued himself into his position. And I go, oh. So I go, this is what I did. I go, sir, if you would just kindly sit down and have a seat. He said, what did you say? And I said, sir, if you would just kindly sit down and have a seat, I'd be glad. And then he leans in, turns his head, and he says, what did you say? And then I don't say anything. I go, and he looked at the restaurant, and it was dead quiet. Everyone was looking at him. He put his hand in his pocket, grabbed the money, threw it down, and he said, we're done here. And he walked out. I turned over to Neil and I said, I'm alive. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, so stop before the quarrel breaks out. This was just, I think, brilliantly modeled in Jesus. Paul picks it up as the next philosopher, if you will. And he says, as the Lord's servant, you must not be what? Quarrelsome, but kindly to everyone, and an apt teacher, patient, correcting opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant that they will repent. And repent in the Greek, of course, means to rethink your thinking. And it includes obedience, but to rethink your thinking. And come to know what? Notice the epistemology there. And come to know the truth. That they may escape the snare of the devil, having been held captive by him to do his will. Paul also says that, it says in Acts that he went to the synagogues, and what did he do? He argued persuasively. Yes, we shouldn't be about quarrels, but yes, we should follow Jesus in arguing, but of course with gentleness and respect. And that's one of the great things I just adore about reasons to believe. One other thing that I would want to mention, in my exploration of Jesus as a metaphysician, his view of the body and the soul, I think, has some tremendous application about how we go about our Christian practices. And though this may seem odd at first, I want you to hear me on this. I had recently been reading a book by Thomas Long, and his book called Accompany Them with Singing, the Christian Funeral. What he mentions in there is that our funeral practices have changed quite a bit over the years. And what he does in the book is he shows how a distinctively Christian funeral practices have the power to instruct and shape the hearts of mourners. And this is anchored actually in Jesus' philosophical and theological understanding of the body and soul. Long says this, please listen to his words. He says, performing Christian rituals, like funeral rituals, well is not merely an issue of propriety, not merely an issue of sensitive pastoral care, or an issue of liturgical taste or tradition, but is rather a matter, please hear this, a matter of retelling or telling the gospel truth, of giving testimony to the faith, of acting out in the face of grief and loss our deepest convictions about the promises of God in the risen Christ, and enabling us and our children to discover meaning and hope amid the ravages of death. Jesus knew that God sustains the soul despite the death of the body. As the Athanasian Creed says, at the coming all people will arise bodily and give an account for their deeds. And I've kind of marveled as both a Christian pastor and a philosopher, especially us in Southern California in the West, thus who are a part of the living, we have tended to start to talk about the human person as body and brain. And when you listen to sermons, much is said about brain and body, and little is said of the mind's place in the soul. And the soul is almost removed from our natural language. And we sort of bought into a physicalist understanding of the human person. But yet when it comes to the funeral, when I listen to people's words and how our funerals operate, now, and please don't hear me being critical here, but I listen to what's going on, and no longer is a body present at a funeral in almost all cases. And there is little talk of resurrection, but a lot of talk about overcoming grief and comforting of the mourner. I'm not against that. I was a pastor. I'm for that. But what happens is I hear people starting to talk like Plato and not Jesus. That we are freed from this prison house of a body, and we're now in heaven with God in this soulless existence. But that is an intermediate state awaiting the glorious resurrection of our body. And so what Long tries to show is that the deceased is on a journey with God, moving to a place where we're awaiting that glorious resurrection with him. Yes, to be absent from suffering and to be with the Lord is wonderful and great. But what we do here, even with the body and soul, is greatly important. Here's what Long says. He says the early Christians, as they broke away from the Hebrew and the Roman traditions and started to understand Jesus' metaphysic and his theology, what they would do as a person was dying, they would go and they would surround the person with prayers and they would read psalms. And then when the person was deceased, they would take the body and they would carefully wrap it and anoint it. And then in broad daylight, they would take the body and carry it to the burial site. And this was in great distinction to the Roman practice, which was to do that in the darkness of night. And while they would carry the body, they would sing psalms and recite hymns on the way to the journey to the burial site. And when they were at the burial site, they would then partake in the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. And when they would do that, they would traditionally give each other a holy kiss, but they would also kiss the deceased. And they would caress the body. And this was so radical for an ancient time when it was thought to touch a dead body, or in some different practices was considered unclean and not appropriate. And yet they would care for that body as a pointer to the glory of the resurrection. But please know this is embedded. Even though people would do practices and they wouldn't know the connection, this is ultimately embedded in Jesus' robust view of both body and soul that will be once again reunited when heaven and earth come back together and we get to partner with Jesus forevermore in a resurrected state, which includes both soul and body together. Long's book is a nice corrective to some of the practices that we have today, I think. Finally, let me make this note to conclude. I think understanding Jesus as philosopher emboldens our evangelism. I once told a Buddhist friend who was attending our church, I said, if you could find a better thinker and philosopher than Jesus, you should follow him or her. He said, okay. He went back, studied Buddha, came back a little while later, and said, I can't find anyone better. He became a Christian. Grotius says this. He says, presenting Jesus as a worthy thinker can be a powerful apologetic tool to unbelievers who wrongly assume that Christian belief is a matter of blind faith or irrational belief. If the founder of Christianity is a great thinker, his followers should never demean the human mind. John Lennox put it this way one time. He said, we have the ministry of putting ears back on. If you remember, Peter chops off the ear, Jesus comes back, he gets the ear, he puts it back on. Certainly there's a message of some nonviolence in that, but what our ministry is to help put ears back on that have been chopped off in our culture, whether by the society or the church itself, so that they can once again hear who Jesus is. And I think showing Jesus as an excellent philosopher is one way to put ears back on. Dr. Luke Timothy Johnson, New Testament professor at Emory University, says this. He asks a question, is it fair to consider Matthew's Jesus as an ancient philosopher? He says Matthew's gospel insists that we do think of him in this way. Jesus is a teacher. He has disciples or students, and he teaches those learners how to live and how to be happy, how to be blessed. And this is exactly what the ancient philosophers taught. He says the 8 statements in Matthew's Sermon on the Hill would have been recognized as being an expression of wisdom, that skill to live life. And he used aphorisms and maxims just like the other philosophers. He concludes, he says, Jesus looks like a philosopher in Matthew, and Jesus sounds like a philosopher in Matthew. Jesus is a philosopher. Jesus is a philosopher, but he is, I admit, the only philosopher to continue his teaching after death because he's alive and well. All right, thank you.